Surveyor-General of South Australia. He graduated from the University of Adelaide with a degree in surveying in 1962 and holds postgraduate diplomas in town planning and business administration. John has a long-standing interest in the history of surveying in South Australia and has given several presentations on the subject. His interest in Todd stems from Todd's contributions to the technological and professional development of surveying in the state. Andrew Jones is a practitioner in the areas of surveying and spatial information. He graduated with a Bachelor of Technology in Surveying from the South Australian Institute of Technology in 1973 and holds postgrad qualifications in surveying science, mathematics and business administration. Excuse me. Andrew is currently a Senior Strategist at the Office of the Chief Information Officer. He also contributes to the work of the International Standards Organisation in the area of geographic information. Andrew.
Thank you, Rob. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of my collaborator, John Porter, to this presentation. John unfortunately couldn't be with us today for health reasons, but without him the presentation wouldn't have happened at all. Before talking about Todd's contribution to surveying in South Australia, it's necessary to provide some historical context. In 1834, by royal decree, South Australia was created as a self-governing province, its western and eastern borders defined by longitudes 132 and 141 east, respectively. Initially, this left a strip of New South Wales separating the province from Western Australia. However, in 1858, the South Australian government petitioned Queen Victoria for the annexation of the corridor of New South Wales between 129 and 132 east. A common border between South and West Australia was achieved after 1861. The problem now became how to mark the exact position of 129 east and 141 east on the ground, so that the limitations of authority of the adjoining colonies could be clearly defined. Conceptually, the determination of longitude is fairly simple. Longitude is the difference between local time and the time at Greenwich at a particular instant. The challenge in the early 19th century was to accurately determine the time at Greenwich. This was an inherently difficult undertaking. The astronomic techniques available to the surveyors of the day, lunar observations or transportation of chronometers, tended to be error-prone and frequently produced large disparities between results. Indeed, the Adelaide Advertiser of 29 October 1867 stated, "It is known that competent mathematicians often differ in the fixing of longitude, and are, as a rule, fortunate if they come within half a mile of each other." It's interesting to note that when South Australia's first Surveyor-General, Colonel William Light, arrived in the new province with his team of surveyors in 1836 and established a network of trigonometric stations across the Adelaide Plains as geographic points for a speedy set out of land parcel corners. The only astronomic observations recorded were for the determination of true north. None of the official plans of the original land division of the Adelaide Plains show any reference to latitude or longitude. In the case of Adelaide and its surrounds, this did not matter. However, it mattered a great deal for land abutting the eastern and western colonial borders, as these had been exactly defined as lines of longitude by royal decree. By 1839, the need to physically mark the boundary between South Australia and New South Wales had become pressing. In that year, the Governor of New South Wales, Sir George Gipps, commissioned Surveyor Charles Tyers to ascertain the true place of the 141st meridian. Tyers based his survey on the longitude of Fort Macquarie, which was located on the site now occupied by the Sydney Opera House. For many years, Fort Macquarie had been the basis from which explorers and surveyors had established geographical positions in land. Its accepted longitude at the time had principally been derived from the lunar observations of early navigators. Consistent with the earlier comments in the advertiser, the individual determinations exhibited significant variation. Tyers set about determining the longitude of a base station, Tyers Mark, at the mouth of the Glenelg River. His approach was to simultaneously implement 3 different survey techniques: lunar observations, transportation of chronometers, and triangulation for Melbourne, each providing an independent check on the other 2. His results again reflected the difficulties encountered by early surveyors when fixing meridians. The 3 longitude values spanning a range of 1 minute and 31 seconds, or around about 2¼ kilometres. Not unreasonably, Tyers adopted the mean of the 3, being 141 degrees 0123 seconds. Then began a period of disputation. In 1841, Tyers' fixing was challenged by the official British cartographer John Arrowsmith in an article published in the South Australian Register. The fixing was subsequently recalculated by Commander Owen Stanley, who arrived at a result that differed by 40 seconds from that of Tyers. That's 40 seconds of arc. The position of Tyers Mark was then remeasured by Captain Stokes, and again by Commander Stanley, all of whom came up with different answers. The ongoing uncertainty created a belt of disputed land, described in official documents as a haven for sly groggers, ex-convicts and bushrangers. And it left the New South Wales and South Australian police and land administrators unclear as to how far their jurisdictions extended. After a series of murders in the disputed territory in the 1840s, it was clear that jurisdiction issues had to be resolved. And this meant accurately marking the 141st meridian northward from the coast. In 1847, New South Wales Government surveyor Henry Wade met with his South Australian counterpart Edward White at the Glenelg River to establish the correct border. The 2 surveyors agreed to accept Tyers' measurements and Stanley's original recalculation of Tyers base station before establishing a start point on the 141st meridian and commencing the survey north. After delays due to lack of supplies, lack of funds and drought, White finally completed the survey in December 1850. But there was trouble brewing. The longitude of the newly built Sydney Observatory had been determined in the late 1850s and early 1860s by means of lunar observations. The calculations revealed that the Fort Macquarie longitude adopted by Tyers was considerably too great, and that consequently the boundary between the colonies of Victoria and New South Wales had very probably been marked too far west. Indeed, Tyers, having adopted the Fort Macquarie longitude base, which according to more modern determinations was more than 2 miles in error, and having carried out his own work with all the accuracy which was possible under the circumstances, had placed the start point for the boundary well to the west of the 141st meridian. Modern surveys today confirm that Wade's starting point was more than 3 kilometres too far west, while the final mark placed by White, who completed the line to the River Murray, was a further 586 metres to the west. In the meantime, in 1855, Charles Todd had arrived in Adelaide to take up the role of government astronomer. It wasn't long before he met up with Surveyor Charles Hope Harris, Surveyor General Goyder's senior executive advisor, and an experienced trigonometric surveyor. This connection was the start of a long and close working relationship between Todd and the South Australian surveying profession. Following the electric telegraph connection in 1867 between Adelaide and Sydney via Wentworth on the River Murray, Surveyor General Goyder approached Todd to assist with the fixing of a starting point near the river for the northward extension of South Australia's border with New South Wales. The suspected error in the existing border position had made it imperative that the position of the 141st meridian be subject to a fresh determination. The governments concerned ordered the work to be done by the government astronomers of the respective states. Todd conferred with New South Wales astronomer George Smalley on the approach to be used. They decided to establish a temporary observatory just north of the River Murray, close to the extension of White's survey line from his stone cairn near the south bank. The temporary observatory would be connected by telegraph to Sydney and Melbourne on the Adelaide line. The differences in longitude between the temporary observatory, Sydney and Melbourne would be established by exchange of time signals from Sydney and Melbourne on several clear nights. The longitude of the Sydney Observatory, determined in 1859 and 1860, would provide the basis for the final calculations. On Friday, May the 1st, 1868, Todd, accompanied by Deputy Surveyor General Mr. A.B. Cooper, arrived at Chowella on the River Murray. The party established a temporary observatory station near Lake Litra and carried out the necessary observations. On 9th and 10th May, the transits of 10 stars over the meridian of the observatory at Sydney and at the temporary observatory were recorded and simultaneously at both stations. On 13th and 14th of May, the transits of 21 stars were similarly recorded at the temporary observatory and at Melbourne. Exchange of time signals between these Melbourne and Sydney observatories was also effected. Todd subsequently calculated that the 141st meridian lay 2 miles, 44 chains and 68 links due east of the observatory. Cooper and his survey crew carefully chained this distance and placed a mark on the border. They then placed a brick-based obelisk near the bank of the Murray to mark the meridian's position. This became the starting point for the South Australian surveyor Thomas Evans to accurately mark out the position of the SA New South Wales border. Today, the obelisk is deemed to be only 5.7 seconds of arc from the true position. Finally, Todd's party marked their observation station with a large post on which was painted on the south face the determined latitude and longitude, on the east face the observer's name, Charles Todd, on the north face the distance to the province boundary, and on the west face, as well as also on the east face, the government ownership symbol, the arrowhead, which at that time was used broadly across the British Empire. The loss of over 500 square miles of South Australian territory sparked a legal battle between adjoining states, a dispute which grew even more vigorous after 1883, when the chain of telegraphically determined longitudes between Greenwich and Australia was completed, and further confirmed within sufficiently narrow limits the results of Todd in 1868. Eventually, in February 1911, the case was taken before the High Court of Australia, which decided that the surveyor's marks constituted the boundary, and the fact that it did not exactly coincide with the 141st meridian did not warrant the readjustment claimed by South Australia. Evidence of Todd's survey can still be found today. In April 1991, the Institution of Surveyors, the Department of Lands and the Royal Geographic Society of Australasia mounted an expedition to relocate Todd's observation station. The party found clear evidence of the original cut lines of 1868 and set out the position of Todd's original observation station and the point of intersection between Todd's east-west line and White's boundary. At the location of the observation station was placed a wooden post, fittingly of River Red Gum, carrying the same inscription as that on the post placed by Todd and his party all those years previously. A plaque commemorating the event was also placed. The fixing of the SA-WA border experienced the same false starts as the SA-Victoria border. And while Charles Todd was not directly involved in the identification, his telegraph network certainly was. The first attempt to place any form of mark on that border occurred in 1866, when the SA government let a special contract to private surveyor E.A. de Lissa. He was requested to run a traverse from Fowler's Bay westward for a distance of approximately 330 kilometres to the top of the Gulf to locate the province boundary. De Lissa cut a 103-kilometre survey line northwesterly through Mallee Scrub from Fowler's Bay Post Office to the edge of the Nullarbor Plain, and then continued across open terrain to the border. Unfortunately, de Lissa's determination of the border was about 1.5 miles too far west, leading to a belief that a safe landing point near the Eucla Sandhills was within South Australia. The government subsequently dispatched Lieutenant Douglas, President of the Marine Board, in 1867 to place an obelisk on the 129th meridian near the cliff face. Douglas's fixing, based on chronometers brought from Adelaide, clearly indicated that the harbour was in Western Australia. By the 1870s, Todd's telegraph network had reached Fowler's Bay. It was soon extended along de Lissa's cut line to the Nullarbor Plain and onto Eucla to complete the Adelaide-Perth connection in 1877. 3 years later, in 1880, Captain Howard sailed to Eucla and used the telegraph signals to remeasure the longitude of Douglas's border obelisk. Howard's observations largely corroborated the position of Douglas's cairn, his longitude determination being only 2 seconds of arc different. By now, however, there was a reluctance to accept even these results as being sufficient for a border definition. Todd's successor, the government astronomer Sir George Dodwell, in his report for 1812, commented that Howard's careful observations enabled longitudes in the vicinity of Eucla to be considered sufficiently accurate for topographic purposes, but not for the establishment of a state boundary line. Accordingly, the marking of the border was not finalised until the 1920s, when higher accuracy longitude fixings through the advent of an international time radio signals became possible. In relation to the Overland Telegraph, in 1870, when the British Australian Telegraph Company announced its willingness to establish the telegraphic link to Australia from London, Todd, as we've heard, was quick to ensure that the resultant telegraph traffic to all Australian colonies would be directed through Adelaide. And while contracts could be immediately issued for line construction from south from Port Darwin and north from Port Augusta to previously surveyed areas, the same could not be done for the central section, which spanned through 960 kilometres of inhospitable country beyond Lake Eyre. The territory had been explored by Stewart a few years earlier, in 1862. However, Stewart had not conducted a thorough survey of the area, and it was still largely unknown. The SA government called upon Surveyor General Goyder to carry out route selection through the central section using his own teams. Some casual exploration north of Lake Eyre had been carried out by drover John Ross in 1868-69, and after consulting with Todd, Goyder sought Ross's assistance to conduct a more thorough survey. To facilitate progress, Todd split the section into 5 subsections, each being supervised by a government surveyor with an assistant and a junior or cadet, some of whom are in this picture. Ross and his team followed Stewart's tracks as close as possible and had to deviate in the McDonnell Ranges. During this survey, the Todd River was named, and Simpson Gap and Alice Springs were mapped for the first time. Finally, at a meeting held in Adelaide in September 1882, a proposal was put forward to establish a professional association of surveyors. The aim was to advance the science of survey measurement by setting standards of education and training, developing field practices, and lobbying for the improvement of land legislation. Foundation membership was to be offered to 46 individuals. An honorary membership extended to 3 persons: Surveyor General Goyder, his senior advisor Charles Hope Harris, and Postmaster General Sir Charles Todd. At the inaugural meeting of the newly formed institute, Todd was elected as its president, a position he held between the formative years of 1882 to 1888. Todd continued to set and mark the astronomy exam paper until his retirement. In conclusion, throughout his career in South Australia, Sir Charles Todd was truly a major contributor to the development of the colony's geodetic and cadastral surveying practices. His long and close working relationship with the South Australian surveying profession was mutually beneficial. His knowledge and practical application, exhibited through major improvements to longitude determination and contributions to the training and professional development of surveyors, served the state and profession very well. Similarly, members of the profession provided important support to Todd, most notably during the establishment of the central section of the Overland Telegraph. It is for these reasons that Sir Charles Todd will continue to be remembered by the profession as a giant of his time, and one who demonstrably advanced the technical and professional practice of surveying in the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and of course thank you to your colleague John. Indeed, thanks to all our speakers and also to our redoubtable timekeeper Chris, who's also been running AV and effecting emergency repairs. We've now got a bit of time for questions. If we have some, and I hope we do, please could the speakers again repeat the question for the benefit of the camera so we get everything on record. First question. Yes, over here.
Question to Dennis Cryle. You said that in 1872 that Todd got the Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George, second class. Considering Todd's performance, what the hell do you have to do to get a first class?
Yes, the question was about what Charles Todd had to do to get a first class when he was given a Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George in 1872. It was a point of contention across Australia because Todd's name was very widely circulated, both through photos as well as through print reports. And with the politicians, I think Ayres was at that point knighted, and Ayres' administration had only been in really for the back end, that is, since Todd had been in the Territory. There had been 3 administrations that Todd had to deal with, which complicated his task considerably. And there was, I think, some concern about that point, but it wasn't until 1893 that Todd was actually made a Knight Commander. And it's interesting that John Forrest in Western Australia, of course, was a good friend of Todd's, was knighted well before him. So there was, I think, this rivalry going on in Todd's life between the politicians and someone as powerful and as competent as Todd. The politicians got in early, but Todd caught up in the end.
Sounds as if we copped it from the eastern states again. Next question. Yes, one there and then one there.
Just 3 quick comments. I think it's Peter Taylor's book on the Overland Telegraph that has a lovely account of Todd's welcome back to Adelaide after the Overland Telegraph completed, where I think the procession leaves from Victoria Square, goes down to the Jubilee Oval, and as Todd enters the Jubilee Oval with the procession, the band strikes up, "See the Conquering Hero Comes." Second point is Todd was very dilatory with his annual reports. I think in 1884 he published the first one for about 16 years, and he was taken to task for this, and in the following report, which he didn't publish for a further 11 years, he sort of explains how he'd been very busy. He really had time. It's a long time since I read them, but they are worth hunting out and reading the introduction. And the third point is, amid all the puns, the one that I've always liked is, I think he was offered a cup of tea, so without my tea I would be odd.
You can just see it now. I'm sorry, Your Excellency, but the dog ate my surveying homework. Yes, a question there.
In what year was Todd knighted, and at what age would he have been?
At what year was Todd knighted and what age would he have been? Any takers on that one?
The question was, at what age was Todd knighted? He was born in 1826. He was knighted in 1893. So he was short of 70. So what is it? Put me on the spot there. 67, thank you very much. I'll take that one.
This will be well known to others, but where are he and his family buried?
North Road Cemetery.
North Road Cemetery is the burial place. Other questions? This is a golden opportunity. At the back there?
Another comment just reminded me of the mystery of where Todd died. I was the honorary historian for the Port Adelaide Historical Society for a long time, and someone, I think I'm right, had the name of a house at Semaphore, where Todd died, but didn't know where the house was, and we didn't recognise the name because it was before street numbering. So if anyone here has any clues on that, I'd be very grateful to hear.
A comment and question on the house in Semaphore where Todd died. We'll try and pick that up later. Yes, question at the back.
A question to Mac. Is it your impression that at the colonial Met conferences, in the three of them, that he was sort of accepted, Todd was accepted as sort of a senior figure in that group?
The question was Todd's seniority at the three Met conferences that occurred. No, the reading of it is that there were at least three of them who attended all conferences. New Zealand, I'm sorry, I can't bring the names to mind at the moment, but his equivalent in New South Wales, Victoria, himself and New Zealand attended all three conferences, so they had equal seniority. I think where Todd's seniority actually came to show itself was that by the time Federation came along, the others had dropped off the twig for whatever reason, retired, died, so Todd was still senior. So his seniority was actually something that came with the longevity of time. While I have the floor, just briefly, we mentioned about Todd returning from the Overland Telegraph. We stumbled across an article in the paper that in November of 1872, there were two municipal banquets that were held, from our understanding, there may have been others, to celebrate the Overland Telegraph. One was in New South Wales, in Sydney, and the other was in Adelaide. And indeed, the excitement was that they were talking to each other by telegraphy. They were it seems as though they're vast enterprises actually held in the outdoors, so it was outdoors with literally hundreds or thousands of people attending. And of course, newspapers of the day, we didn't just have reportage, but we actually had people who wrote literature, because that was their main way of communicating, was through the newspaper, without telephones and radios, of course. So it makes absorbing reading, to read what they had to say was happening at these outdoor events. For the Adelaide one, it's touching. There was something like about 7 or 10 official speakers, and undoubtedly a number of them have been on the sauce. And it wasn't actually declared, but you only had to read between the lines to realize that these guys were slurring and probably saying things in a normal circumstance they wouldn't. But every now and then there'd be this absolute pearl. And these would be people who would be speculating on what the Overland Telegraph was actually going to mean for the future of Australia. And reading it is almost like reading the accounts we see today of the internet. How is the internet going to shrink our world? How is the internet going to change commerce? How is the internet going to change social interconnection? How is the internet going to change our country? How is the internet going to change us as individuals? In 1872 in November, there were people who were making equal speculations about the Overland Telegraph. And I think it's really touching to realize nothing is really new today. And it hasn't been brought up today. I know Richard was hoping to bring one of Todd's portable telegraph keys. Now, Todd carried a portable telegraph key with him. All he needed was a telegraph wire. He could then sling it onto the wire, and he'd be connected to the National Telegraph Network. That was our first portable telephone. Or as somebody has pointed out, it's actually our first portable SMS. Secondly, for those of you who are technically minded, there is no doubt that Todd is actually our internet pioneer, because the telegraph, especially the one that went overseas, keeping in mind that what is an internet if it's nothing but an electronic signal that's based on a digital concept of zeros and ones, ons and offs, or indeed dots and dashes, which is exactly what the telegraph network was. So Todd was the first in Australia to be a practicing user of a mobile telephone, and indeed he put in the beginnings of the NBN. And we actually invited the NBN to be here today. We invited the NBN to be here today, but I think they saw that obviously the transmission speed was a bit too low for them to really take on board.
We've got time for one more. Yes.
In the first section, the word and object time balls was used. I don't know who spoke about it, but could you tell us what they are?
Time lords or laws? Sorry, I was getting mixed up with Doctor Who there.
The question was, what's a time ball? Ship navigators needed to be able to set their chronometers to an exact time. It's normally 1 o'clock they set it to. And they were a couple of large spheres. I have the size of, I think it's about 10 foot in diameter, the one down at Semaphore. It was raised to the top of a mast, and then at the appointed time of 1 o'clock, it was dropped. And that drop meant that the ship's navigators out to sea could actually see that that was 1 o'clock. The second ball, why there was two balls, was if there was a problem in dropping the ball, it had gone too early, too late, or there's a problem. The second ball dropped, and that told people, don't set your time with that one, it was wrong, and then they reset the time balls, and I may be wrong, but I think it was 15 minutes later they redid the job. So time balls, just two large spheres that were dropped to set the time.
Thank you. And the tradition persists with New Year's Eve in New York. If you watch, there's a time ball that comes down on the change of the year. Sorry?
That's the origin of the name of semaphore, isn't it?
Yes. No, semaphore is the flags, which is what?
Another signalling spot.
The question was that the name of semaphore. No, semaphore was the flags that were used by the pilots to communicate with the ships, and they were telling ships information about tide times, water depths, and the ships would bring back information about their cargoes. So that's where the semaphore comes from.
Thank you. Yes, Richard.
Thanks, Rob. Very quickly, to add to the long list of contributions of Charles Todd, Martin has mentioned the intercolonial postal conferences. In about 1893, one of the things that I didn't have time to mention, Todd, of course, chaired a committee that as electricity distribution was starting to become common, there was concern about electrical interference between the wires and the telegraph system. So Charles Todd's committee established the very first standards for electricity distribution throughout Australia. So there's another list of his achievements we shouldn't lose sight of. And to build on Mac's comments on the night of the closing of the telegraph line, where Todd had journeyed some distance south and was in fact at Central Mount Stewart using his portable telegraph key, he spent the evening texting.
Probably during dinner. One last question we have time for. Yes, at the back.
Just for Mac, I guess one of the really interesting things to me is that my knowledge of Todd came from Neville Nichols, who talked about in terms of climate science, in that in the late 1800s he recognised droughts in Australia and India being linked, and so actually was a very early recognition of the teleconnections and El Nino and so on. So Neville Nichols always points to Todd as not only a meteorologist, but a very eminent climate scientist.
I'm about to put somebody on the spot here. We have our supervising meteorologist, John Nairn. John, do you wish to make comment?
No, I think... My early training was sparsity of words, okay, and that was actually linked to my early career, where we were trained to be very limited in our
We also have with us, actually, we do have John Zillman, who used to head up the WMO, and I think probably what we're saying here is that meteorology is not something that knows colonial boundaries, and indeed obviously doesn't even know national boundaries, but is very much an international event. And you know, the whole concept of what's happening in the Indian Ocean, let alone the Pacific Ocean, affecting our weather, I think what you just flagged is that it actually was developing in that period.
Yes.
John Hogan was the director of meteorology in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, or around about that time, when I started and he was extremely interested in the communication between Adelaide and India. very subject of the charts and so on, the research that went on. I'm sure there's a lot of information about of establishing information. There's a lot of communication somewhere about the story.
There was a statement that there was an interest in early days, well, certainly in earlier days, about the connection between India and Australia. Of course, they were both colonial establishments. One thing that we noticed in the Todd journals, by the way, was a number of logs from ship's logs. Todd would send some of his people out to Port Adelaide to ask for copies of the logs. He actually got the physical log itself. They didn't have photocopiers in those days. What was the importance of that is that these ships were actually taking readings in the middle of the ocean. There was no other opportunity for taking meteorological readings. So the gold standard for this international hunt we have for lost meteorological data, the poster child is actually Cook's journey through the Pacific in the late 1700s and the meteorological observations that he was taking then. But part of our digitizing process that we're doing is going through those ships' logs and picking them up. And funnily enough, most of those ships actually sailed between Ceylon and South Australia, as of course is now Sri Lanka. And all that we can surmise is obviously Ceylon was kind of like a distribution point for the rest of the colonial system in the east. So items would find their way to Colombo or wherever in Ceylon, and then our ships would go independently from the various colonies and pick up the bits and pieces and find their way back to Australia. And it's those ships' logs which are allowing us to build at least some kind of an erratic view of what the weather was at the time in the Indian Ocean.
Thanks, Meg. We're running out of time. One quickie.
You can make the answer to this quickly. A contemporary public servant of Todd's has been mentioned by a couple of speakers, namely George Woodruff Goyder. Some people hold him in very high regard. The Geographical Society where I come from has honoured him. I'm wondering, I've never heard any talk of the relation between these two contemporaries. Each great respective field. I don't doubt Todd much more widely. Any of the speakers know anything about the relations these two have, one with the other, since they are contemporaries in important tasks?
I'd be interested to know. Goyder is my second name. I'm a relative of him.
Thank you, Rob. There's every reason to believe that Goyder and Todd were actually close friends, as well as colleagues. One of the things that Jane and I discovered when we were researching Wire Through the Heart, the documentary on the Overland Telegraph, was that there are a lot of things that are left unsaid and a lot of dots not connected. But Goyder and Todd undoubtedly had a close relationship and they communicated with each other constantly on many issues. So I think any historian or person interested in South Australian history would have to say the two sort of rate together very highly in different fields. May I also just say one more thing? We've talked a lot about the construction of the Overland Telegraph. Without Todd, there wouldn't have even been the exploration for it. He was a great friend of James Chambers, who funded much of John McDouall Stewart's work. And as good as Stewart was, he had a few personal problems. Todd seems to have the method of inspiring Stewart to get out there and keep going. And without any doubt, for me as a researcher, it was Todd's vision which actually kept Stewart on the road. So in effect, without Todd's vision, there would not have been even the exploration in the first place.
Thanks very much. It's not surprising, I think, that a lot of these people didn't connect. Adelaide was an extraordinary place in those days. Our family album, I'm descended from Stirling as well, and Stirling was the first director of the museum and of course was on the great explorations of Central Australia, the Horn and the Transcontinental. And so of course deciding that this would be a utopian society, which they largely made it with hugely advanced and civilised ideas, and having something of the money to achieve it, like the donations that you see everywhere from Elder, you had all these extraordinarily qualified and well-motivated people, all dealing with each other and all connected, and it was a very, very fortunate thing that they were. However, we haven't got time for any more questions, but I'm going to bring forward an announcement I was going to make. You'll be I mean, we've got a wealth of information here, and everybody's interested in the topic, and there are lots of people writing biographies and getting information together. So you'll be interested to know that a Todd Interest Working Party is being formed to start the process of better curating the Todd legacy. I'm sorry about my voice, it's going on me. It's the penalty of asthma. Those interested in participating can make their interest known through info@charlestodd.net, and I'll repeat that later. So any further questions or contributions or observations on what you've heard, please put them into that and we can keep this symposium going. But it's now my pleasure to invite Julia Squires, Sir Charles Todd's great-great-granddaughter, to present a clock, this wonderful clock you've seen down there, to the State Library of South Australia. And the clock was awarded to Sir Charles on the occasion of his 75th birthday. It's inscribed on the top by the Society of Engineers, of which he was a founding member. And this clock has been generously donated by Jeremy Squires, a great-great-grandson of Sir Charles, and was recently brought from England by Julia, who will present it now to Tony Leshen, the Collection Development Manager for the library. Julia.
Everybody, I'll just say a very few words. It's certainly a fairly well-travelled clock. It's been at least from here back to the UK and then back here again now. I spoke to cousin Jeremy and I asked him if he had heard any particular stories about how it came to be back in England, or how he's in the inheritance of his father, who was also our uncle John Squires. He doesn't have any particular memories, except that he says he's always known how absolutely proud Uncle John had always been, both of the clock and of his Todd heritage, as indeed was our father as well. Jeremy feels that the clock would be well returned here for its future and for its safekeeping. His main regret was that he can't be here with us as well, but so on his behalf, I'd like to present it to the State Library. Yes, I did start it up when I brought it back from England, and it dinged fairly loudly and completely unpredictably at all hours of day and night, with no relation to what the time actually is, so it may need a little bit of attention. I had to wrap it in a few T-shirts in the back of the cupboard in the end, but it does work.
Thank you. I don't really have anything prepared, but I am aware that Sir Charles Todd was actually the longest ever serving member of the Libraries Board, so there's a certain level of appropriateness in the clock coming to the State Library to join the other papers that we have. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. And there's the case, of course. Well, thank you very much. And it's now, to conclude the symposium, would you please welcome Susie Hertzberg, another Todd, great-great-granddaughter, who would like to thank our speakers. Susie.
Thanks, Rob. I'm really delighted on behalf of all the Todd descendants to thank all the speakers here today for such entertaining and informative presentations. Now, there are many of us Todd descendants, and I think at last count, I found about 20 great-grandchildren still alive, 50 great-greats, more than 100 great-great-greats, and a few dozen great-great-great-greats. And when about 18 months ago, I mentioned to Mac, whose presentation on meteorology a few of the English Todd relations had seen, that we were going to try and celebrate the 140th anniversary of the completion of the Overland Telegraph, and did he know of any activities happening at the same time? Well, Mac, with huge enthusiasm, said, look, I'd love to have a look and see about this. And within a few weeks, I think, this is 18 months ago, he'd got back saying, I'm finding a lot of enthusiasm and we'll be able to have a seminar, a symposium. And I think for his enthusiastic response and all that he's done has been fantastic. He's brought a group of people together who've got a passion for Charles Todd that has been fantastic to see and that we've all really enjoyed. So thank you very much, Matt. This hugely enthusiastic response has given us some speakers that most families would be only too delighted to hear, because it's not every family who can get all these experts who can come and tell you all about great-great-grandfather and just the things that he has done that we've been so impressed by this morning. So a huge thank you to all of our speakers. And as a number of us in the Todd family descendants own Manyara Vineyard, it seemed quite appropriate to recognise our speakers with a bottle of Manyara premium wine. So on behalf of all the family, I would like to thank Rob, Reg, Richard, Martin, Dennis, Andrew, Mac, and also Rob Morrison for their roles today. And could I actually particularly thank Rob Morrison for pulling together the connections with Science Week, which has been so supportive. And while I'm saying my thank yous, we only have to look at the front of that booklet to see the impressive array of organisations who've been part of today's presentation, to thank them all their members who provided that wonderful morning tea that we've had and who provided access to this terrific venue. So special thanks, and now if the speakers could come, then I'll be able to hand them their bottle of wine and then back to Rob for finishing remarks.